There is a moment in the first season finale, after the buildings have come down, and the train has crashed, and Mark is lying broken in the snow with blood on his teeth, where Nolan Grayson holds his son in the air and asks him what he would have, after everything else was gone, when all of this was dust. Mark answers him, and Nolan drops him into the wreckage and flies away, into the clouds and out of the planet, and the fandom has been arguing about every single second of that scene ever since. What Nolan really wanted, whether he meant any of it, whether the answer he received was the answer he was waiting for. Tonight we are going through every fan theory the Invincible community has built around moments like that one, the big ones and the obscure ones, the canon-supported readings and the wild reaches, the ones that sit comfortably inside the show and the ones that lean on the comic and the cosmos beyond it. So get comfortable, turn the lights down, this is going to be a long, slow walk. And if you have not subscribed to Rock yet, it really does help us keep making these. The oldest theory in the catalog is also the one the show itself keeps quietly feeding without ever resolving. Mark Grayson, despite every promise he makes Eve in a kitchen, despite every speech he gives a city about being one of the good ones, is on a slow, inevitable path to becoming his father. Not in the cartoon sense, where one day he snaps and starts slaughtering crowds. In the deeper, sadder sense, where the things that made Nolan terrifying are the same things that are slowly turning Mark into someone he would not have recognized at 17. The argument begins with the obvious, the half-Viltrumite biology. The longevity that means Mark will eventually outlive every person he loves on Earth, including his mother, including Amber, including Eve if he is unlucky, certainly including William and Rex, and every human friend he has ever made. Nolan walked that road first. He stood over a baby in a crib, and he could already do the maths of how many of those tiny human lives he would have to bury before he buried his son. And the show has taken great care to let that same maths begin to dawn on Mark too. In the quiet moments after fights, when his mother's hair has more gray in it, and his college friends are talking about jobs and futures, and Mark cannot bring himself to think more than a year ahead. The theory does not say Mark will choose to conquer Earth. It says Earth will eventually feel small to him in the exact way it eventually felt small to his father. And that smallness is the thing that turned Nolan into the man who walked into a room with his colleagues and walked out alone. The version that goes further leans on the violence. The show has been very careful to track Mark's tolerance for hurting people, and the line has moved every season. The boy who threw up after the first real fight is not the same person who held the Mauler Twins by the collar and threatened to drop them out of a window. The kid who panicked the first time a villain took a punch from him is now a young man who can break a body open and keep talking, who can stand in a hospital with someone else's blood drying on his shirt and explain calmly to a nurse what happened. Invincible is, among other things, a story about what super strength does to a kid's nervous system. Each season Mark survives a thing he should not have survived, and the next season starts with him stronger, and a little colder, and a little more like the man who beat him through a city. Whether the show ever lets him recover that earlier softness is, in this reading, the real question of the entire series. There is a smaller, more specific version of the Becoming Nolan theory that fans have been quietly building since the second season, and it is about the way Mark talks when he is tired. After Mark comes back from Thraxa, he sits with his mother in their kitchen and says something about the people he could not save, and the cadence of it, the rhythm of the sentence, the slight tilt of the head, is identical to the way Nolan used to deliver the same kind of line in the early episodes, before any of you knew what he was. As far as fans have pieced together, the show is using vocal performance as foreshadowing. Steven Yeun and J.K. Simmons have both spoken in interviews about deliberately layering the two performances, and there are video essays out there which line up Mark's voice in Season 3 next to Nolan's voice in Season 1, and the resemblance is not accidental. Whether you read this as Mark slipping, or as Mark integrating his father into himself the way every grown child does, the show is, very deliberately, letting you hear it. From there we move to the very first scene of the show, which is also one of the most rewatched scenes in modern animation, and to the theory that Omni-Man's slaughter of the Guardians of the Globe was planned for years, but not in the way you think. The obvious reading is that Nolan was always going to do it, because that was the mission. The Viltrumite Empire sent him to soften up Earth, and the Guardians were the only force on the planet capable of organizing serious resistance, so they had to be removed before the conquest could begin. That is what Nolan tells Mark on the train tracks, and most of the fandom takes him at his word. But there is a quieter reading that goes back through every Nolan scene in Season 1 and notices something. Nolan does not actually seem to want to do it. He flinches before the first hit. He pauses before he goes after Aquarius. There is a moment where the Immortal looks him in the face and asks him why, and Nolan does not have an answer ready, and his answer when it comes is the answer of a man working it out in real time. Some readers argue that Nolan had been delaying that order by years, possibly by decades, that the Empire had been pushing him to clear the field and he had been finding reasons not to, and the night of the Guardians' fight was the night he ran out of excuses. Read this way: the slaughter is not a man executing a plan, it is a man failing a test he had been postponing his entire adult life, and the rage you see in the fight is the rage of a husband and father who knows that he has just become a thing his family will never forgive. The cosmic version of this idea goes one step further and argues that the Viltrumite Empire had begun to suspect Nolan's loyalty long before the night in the Guardians' base. The case is circumstantial, because the show has not yet shown you the inside of the Viltrumite chain of command in any real detail, but the pieces are there. The fact that no other Viltrumite is dispatched to check on Nolan in the early years. The fact that when other Viltrumites do finally arrive, in later seasons, they treat Nolan as a problem rather than a colleague. The fact that the Empire seems much more interested in Mark than in any other half-Viltrumite child you ever meet. Fans have stitched these pieces together into a reading where Nolan was always a borderline figure, and the Empire had assigned him to Earth precisely because it was a slow assignment, a low-risk planet where a half-loyal officer could be parked, while higher-ranking soldiers handled the dangerous worlds. The slaughter of the Guardians, in this version, is Nolan's final attempt to prove himself loyal before someone came to check, and the fact that he immediately leaves Earth after Mark refuses to join him is the moment he stops trying to prove anything to anyone. The companion to all of this is the question of why Nolan chose Debbie in the first place. The show has been very careful never to give you a meet-cute, never to give you the full story of how an interstellar warrior ended up married to a real estate agent from the suburbs. Fans have filled that vacuum with several competing readings. The simple version is that Debbie was assigned, that the Empire wanted Nolan embedded, and Debbie was, in some way, vetted or even nudged towards him. The kinder version is that Debbie was a real and accidental love, and that this is the entire reason Nolan kept failing to complete his mission. The version that gets the most traction on the forums is the third, which holds that Debbie was, in Nolan's mind, an experiment. He wanted to see whether a Viltrumite could actually love a human, because if the answer was yes, then everything the Empire had told him about humans being livestock was a lie. The show has dropped one moment that supports this reading, the scene where Nolan, in his last conversation with Debbie before the fight, talks about her as if she has answered a question for him. Whether that question was, "Can I love a human?" or "Can a human love me?" is left for you to decide. The fan reading is that Nolan needed Debbie in order to know who he was, and Mark is the answer to a question that has been running through Nolan's head since long before Debbie was born. The most cheerful theory in the whole catalog is the one that says Debbie Grayson is, in some way, secretly the most important character in the entire show. The argument here is structural. Debbie is the only main character who has no powers, no agency in the cosmic plot, no real way to fight back against anything that is happening, and yet the show keeps returning to her. Almost every major emotional beat is anchored on her face. Every time Mark makes a decision that matters, the show cuts to Debbie hearing about it. Every time Nolan returns, in person or in memory, the camera lingers on her. Debbie, in this reading, is the show's secret protagonist. Mark is the one with the powers, but Debbie is the one with the actual story. Underneath the punching, Invincible is a show about a woman who was lied to for 20 years by the person she trusted most, and who has to rebuild a life around the corpse of that lie, while also raising the only being on the planet who can do anything about it. Every theory about Debbie's future, whether she remarries, whether she joins the Global Defense Agency, whether the Viltrumites eventually come for her, ultimately stems from this reading, which is that the show is not going to be willing to lose her, because losing her means losing the heart it has been building since the very first episode. A related strand has Debbie eventually becoming a kind of unofficial leader of a human resistance, in the event that the Viltrumites do return in force. The most popular version of this idea is Gentle. It does not have Debbie putting on a costume or learning how to fight. It has Debbie organizing the people around her, the families of fallen heroes, the spouses of soldiers, the parents of college kids who suddenly became superhumans. The reading is that Invincible has been quietly setting up an emotional support network as a kind of invisible second team, and that Debbie, by virtue of being the woman who survived Nolan Grayson, is in a strange position to lead it. Nothing in the show confirms this. It is interpretation built on a vacuum, but the vacuum is interesting. The show keeps putting Debbie in rooms with the families of other heroes. It keeps showing you that those families exist. It keeps reminding you that the world of Invincible is full of people whose loved ones died on jobs they did not understand. Read this way: Debbie's eventual role is not to save the world by hitting it, but to be the first person on Earth who actually knows how to grieve a hero. From here, we move into the Cecil cluster. The cluster around Cecil Stedman, the director of the Global Defense Agency, the man who knows everyone's secret and never lets you forget it. The character voiced with such warm, dangerous calm that he has become, for many fans, the most interesting figure on the show. The most popular Cecil reading is also the most direct, and it is the reading that the Global Defense Agency is not, and has never been, what it claims to be. The official story is that the agency exists to protect Earth from extra-normal threats, to coordinate hero responses, to clean up after the kind of fight that levels a city block. That is the surface. Underneath, by this reading, the agency is a black box for the engineering of human weapons against any future Viltrumite occupation. Every Cecil scene, watched this way, is about the long game. The Reaniman project, where the corpses of dead villains are brought back as obedient cyborgs. The deal with D.A. Sinclair, which keeps a sociopathic scientist out of prison in exchange for ongoing access to his designs. The way Cecil's office is always near a vault, always near a door that leads somewhere the camera does not follow. Cecil, the theory says, understood, possibly from the very first time he saw what Omni-Man could do, that Earth was a planet living inside the patience of a god, and that the only realistic way to survive that god leaving or returning was to start manufacturing weapons that did not need to sleep or eat or have second thoughts. The version of this that goes darker is the one that says Cecil knew. The argument is that Cecil's intelligence apparatus is too large, too thorough, too well placed, for him to have somehow missed every signal that Nolan Grayson was something other than what he claimed to be. The show has shown you Cecil's networks. He has eyes inside every hero, inside every villain, inside every embassy, and every laboratory. There are characters who suspect Nolan within minutes of meeting him. Damien Darkblood, a demon detective, walks into the room and sniffs out the truth on the first day. The fan question is, did Cecil really not know? The kind reading is that Cecil suspected and could not prove it, and held his suspicions back because confronting Nolan without proof would have been suicide. The unkind reading is that Cecil knew, possibly for years, and made a calculated bet that he could ride out Nolan's loyalty for as long as the man stayed embedded in his family. Watched this way, every scene where Cecil sits across a table from Nolan and pretends not to notice the cracks is one of the most dangerous diplomatic standoffs in fictional history, conducted with coffee mugs and small talk. The show has never confirmed it, but the theory keeps coming back because so many of Cecil's lines, if you assume he knew, suddenly land differently. The scene in the very first episode where Cecil and Nolan circle each other at the Pentagon, when watched again with this theory in mind, becomes a quiet dance between two men who both already know what the other one is, and are both waiting for the other one to flinch. A smaller theory nests inside this one, about the way Cecil's voice itself is part of the strategy. Cecil's calm, his refusal to ever raise his voice, his habit of speaking to the most terrifying beings on the planet as if he were ordering takeaway, is a deliberate signal. He is showing every superhuman in the room that he is not afraid of them, because he has things they do not understand standing in another room, behind a door they have not opened. This is not exactly a fringe reading, it is more or less what the show is saying out loud. But the wrinkle that fans have added is that Cecil's calm is also Cecil's tell. When Cecil finally does raise his voice, or when Cecil finally does run out of words, the show is going to show you, in that moment, that the man who built his power on never blinking has finally seen the thing he cannot handle. There are forums that keep careful track of every moment Cecil has come close to losing his composure, treating those moments like waypoints on a map, trying to predict the exact arc the show is going to draw between them. There is also a Cecil theory that turns on his body. The show has gone out of its way to remind you that Cecil is aging, that he is not as young as he used to be, that the scar that runs across his face is connected to a story the show has only hinted at. The comic gives some answers here, and fans of the comic have brought those answers into theories about the show, but it is worth being careful, because the show has chosen to keep this part of Cecil quiet, and what the show eventually does with it is its own decision. The reading that travels best argues that Cecil's body has been kept alive, for years, by the same medical and cybernetic shortcuts that he keeps approving for other people. Cecil is, in some sense, partly held together by the same machinery as the Reaniman, and this is going to matter at some point, because the line between Cecil and the men he uses as weapons is going to collapse. Whether the show ever takes this part of the comic is unknown, But the foreshadowing has been there, in the way the show frames his medications, in the way he looks at his own hands in certain scenes, in the small physical hesitations that the performance keeps layering in. A parallel reading runs alongside this one, holding that Cecil's family exists, somewhere, off-camera, and that the show is going to use them. In the comics, Cecil has people who can be used as leverage. The show has not introduced anyone like that yet, on screen, in any verified way. But fans have been combing through every background photograph in Cecil's office, every framed picture, every wallet shot, looking for evidence that the show has quietly planted someone he loves. The moment we meet that person, the theory says, will be the moment Cecil's leverage finally turns the other way, and the show will give us a Cecil who is suddenly the one who can be threatened. There is no confirmation of any of this, and the theory should be treated as exactly what it is, an extrapolation from comic material onto a show that has, so far, made the very deliberate choice not to follow it. The bigger Cecil reading, the one that frames everything else, is the reading of Cecil's endgame. Cecil is, in the long run, the show's quiet antagonist, even if he is never explicitly its villain. Cecil and Mark are on a slow collision course, and the collision has nothing to do with a fight in the traditional sense. Cecil's instinct is to centralize, to collect every superhuman in the world into a system that he can see and manage. Mark's instinct, the more he grows up, is to refuse that kind of system, to make his own choices, to draw his own lines about who he kills and who he spares. Those instincts cannot coexist forever, the theory says, and the show is building, very slowly, towards an episode where Mark looks at Cecil and decides that the agency has to be dismantled. Whether that ends in a confrontation, a resignation, or something quieter, this is the real long arc of the show, the arc that runs underneath the cosmic plot. The Viltrumites are the spectacle. Cecil is the question, and the question is, what do you do with the man on your own side who would do absolutely anything to keep you alive? Next, we come to the most uncomfortable cluster in the catalog, which is the cluster about Robot. Robot, whose real name is Rudy Connors, whose history the show has revealed in pieces, whose body is borrowed, whose face is in some sense not really his, and whose motivations have been a knot that the fandom has been unpicking since the first season. The simplest Robot theory is also the one the show has more or less confirmed, which is that Robot was never just the dispassionate strategist he played in the early episodes, and that the cold calm of his voice in the teen team scenes was hiding something a lot more painful underneath. The deeper reading is that Robot is, of all the characters on the show, the one most aware that his moral choices are running out, and that every step he takes to fix his own circumstances is going to cost someone else something they cannot get back. The version fans return to most often holds that Robot's decisions, the cloning of a new body, the relationship with Monster Girl, the political moves he makes, are not the moves of a young man on his way to becoming a villain. They are the moves of a man who has already decided that he is going to be a villain at the end of all this, and is, in the interim, trying to be a good person for as many days as he can manage before that decision becomes visible to the people he loves. Robot and Monster Girl have their own subplot inside this cluster. Monster Girl carries the curse of aging backwards every time she uses her powers, which means she is, mentally, much older than her body. Robot has chosen, in the show, to grow his own new body at an accelerated rate so that he can stand closer to her in age. This relationship is the show's most dangerous one, the theory says, not because either of them is malicious, but because the dynamic of the relationship is built on something neither of them can fully control. Monster Girl is getting younger. Robot is getting older. The show is using them to ask a question about consent and time. What does it mean to love someone whose age is being decided by a body they did not choose? What does it mean to be loved by someone who built themselves in your shape? There is no easy answer here, and the theory is not that one of them is bad. It is that this is going to end in tragedy, because the show keeps writing them as people trying their best inside a situation that is not really fixable, and that the more decent they keep trying to be, the further they are walking into a corner from which neither of them comes out whole. The cosmic robot theory takes him beyond Earth. The argument is that Robot's intelligence and his comfort with manipulation are going to make him, at some point, an indispensable diplomatic figure in the wider coalition of planets storyline. Mark is the fist, Alan the alien is the heart, and Robot is going to be the head, the cold strategist who actually negotiates the survival of human civilization when the Viltrumite Empire collapses or breaks. Fans who push this reading point to the way the show has built up Robot's competence with every season, the way the camera lingers on him in war rooms, the way the show keeps quietly establishing that he is the only character on Earth who can think on the same scale as Cecil. Robot is being set up as a future world leader, not in the cape and tights sense, but in the actual political sense, and the choice of whether to use that power for good will be the central question of his arc. None of this is confirmed. It is all extrapolation from a character the show is clearly investing in, but the investment is real, and fans are not wrong to notice it. The darker version of all of this argues that Robot is, in the long run, going to do something unforgivable. The case here is structural. The show keeps showing you small, manageable robot betrayals, the kind you can forgive at the moment they happen. The growing of the body without telling the team, the political moves inside the new Guardians, the relationships he allows himself to build under false pretenses. The show, by this reading, is building Robot's threshold for betrayal, episode by episode, and the eventual reveal is going to be that Robot has been planning a much larger move the entire time. What that move is, no one in the fandom can quite agree on. Some think it is the takeover of an existing nation. Some think it is the construction of an artificial superhuman army. Some think it is something with the Sequids, who Robot is more comfortable with than any other character on Earth. The show has kept its options open, and that, in itself, is what makes the theory possible. We turn now to one of the oldest puzzles in the comic fandom, one that the show has so far refused to settle, even though it has had several chances to. It is the question of the Mauler Twins, the two genius scientist clones who appear and reappear across the series, who are almost always destroyed at the end of any storyline they show up in, and who, almost always, come back. The basic puzzle is the one the characters themselves have built their entire dynamic around. There is the original, there is the clone. They both insist they are the original. They do not, in fact, know for certain which of them is. The cloning machine they use has been damaged and rebuilt enough times that the memories of which body went into the tube first are no longer reliable, and they have built an entire personality around bickering about it. The reading that has become almost canonical in the community is the one that says neither of them is the original anymore. The original Mauler died at some point in the past, in some forgotten storyline, and the cloning machine has simply kept printing new copies who all think they are him, and the two we know today are two of the most recent prints, who have inherited the original's certainty without any of the original's actual continuity. Watched this way, the Mauler twins are not a puzzle about which one is real. They are a parable about how identity works when memory is just a file that can be copied. The version that takes this further argues that the show has been quietly playing with the visual evidence. Fans who push this point at specific frames and specific fight scenes, the way one twin tends to lead with the left and the other with the right, the way the scarring on their hands does or does not match certain story beats, the way the show has, on at least one occasion, animated their dialogue with a small but visible asymmetry that disappears in the next episode. None of this is confirmed. It is the kind of theorizing that lives in slow-motion screen captures and frame-by-frame comparisons, the kind of thing that the show may or may not have actually planted. The interpretation is that the writers know exactly who is the original and are sitting on the answer, waiting for a moment to reveal it that will hurt as much as possible. Whether that moment ever arrives depends, as so much else does, on how long the show keeps running. A deeper Mauler reading takes them out of the punchline category entirely and treats them as one of the most morally complicated duos in the show. Strip away the bickering and the petty crime, and the Maulers are two of the most lonely people in the series. The cloning is not about wanting to be in two places at once, but about wanting, very simply, to never be alone in a room. Every time one of them dies, the other one rebuilds him within hours, and the show has been careful to show you that the rebuild is never just transactional. There is grief, and panic, and relief. The Maulers are the show's secret love story, the theory says, in a non-romantic but no less devoted sense, and any plot which forces one of them to permanently lose the other is going to be one of the show's most devastating scenes. There are versions of this reading that imagine the surviving Mauler joining the heroes, or vanishing, or, in the bleakest version, beginning the process of cloning himself again from a sample of his own blood, and trying to teach the new copy everything he can remember about his brother, before either of them notices that something has been lost in the translation. The multiverse cluster is where the show has made one of its boldest moves, and also opened one of its widest doors. Angstrom Levy, the multiversal scientist whose mind is, by his own description, the combined consciousness of every version of himself across the realities, was introduced in the second season and has been positioned by the show as something close to the central villain of the wider arc. The first multiverse reading is the one that says the show is going to use him to introduce a much larger multiversal storyline, and that the alternate Marks Angstrom has glimpsed are not a one-off threat, but a slow drip of foreshadowing. There is a moment in Season 2 where Angstrom shows Mark images of other versions of himself, and the images are deliberately brief and ambiguous. Fans have spent years freeze-framing those shots, building catalogs of what each variant Mark is wearing, what scars he has, what flag is on his shoulder, what city is burning behind him. Some of those variants, the reading goes, are foreshadowing storylines that will happen on screen in later seasons. The most popular interpretation of those frames is that one of the variant Marks is a Tyrant Mark, a Mark who chose his father's side on the train tracks, who said yes when the show's Mark said no, and who went on to become, on his Earth, exactly the conqueror Nolan was sent to make. The show is going to bring this Mark, or a Mark like him, into our Mark's life as a kind of moral mirror, a version of himself he could very easily have been, and the eventual fight between them will be the show's most direct conversation about what choice actually means in a story where the heroes and the villains are made of the same biology. The version of this that fans love most is the one where the Tyrant Mark wins his world but loses his mother, where he is haunted by Debbie's absence in the same way our Mark is haunted by Nolan's, and where the two of them eventually meet not in a fight but in a quiet room, and where Nolan, or the absence of Nolan, is the thing they actually have to talk about. A companion reading argues that Angstrom Levy himself is, despite everything, not really the villain. Angstrom, in his original conception, was a man who genuinely believed in saving lives across realities, and the version of him who collects identities is the result of an accident he was not entirely responsible for. The show is going to redeem him, eventually, either by killing him in an act of late-stage clarity, or by giving him a final scene where he sees something across a reality that snaps him out of the spiral. There are fans who treat Angstrom as a tragic figure rather than a true antagonist, and they tend to be the fans who watch the show with the most patience, because Angstrom on the surface is one of the cruelest villains in the catalog, and you have to look past a lot of damage to find the original idea inside him. A more pessimistic reading says Angstrom is going to break the show open in a way the show cannot recover from, that the multiverse he carries inside his head is going to bleed into the main reality and start damaging things you do not want damaged, and that the show is going to use him to justify a soft reset of some of its plot lines. The case is structural. Long-running superhero stories almost always reach a point where the writers have written themselves into corners they need to back out of, and the multiverse is the most common tool for that retreat. When the show eventually needs to undo something, it will use Angstrom or a successor like him to fold reality and give itself room. Whether you read this as a worry or as a promise depends on how you feel about the genre, but it is a real prediction, and it has been gaining ground. The most cosmic version of the Angstrom theory says he is, in some way, connected to the coalition of planets in a way that has not been revealed yet. The coalition scientists, the ones we have seen working on dimensional research, are aware of Angstrom in a way that has not been made explicit, and there is a deal being negotiated in the background between the coalition and the multiversal versions of Angstrom across realities. Nothing in the show confirms this. It is built on the way the show frames certain conversations between coalition figures and dimensional researchers. But the reading is a useful one because it points at something the show has been quietly doing, which is constructing a sense that the dimensional plot and the cosmic plot are not really two different plots, but the same plot seen from two different angles. From the multiverse we drift to Adam Eve, who is, by a clear margin, the most powerful character in the show, and by a clear margin the character whose power the show has been most careful to leave underexplained. The basic Eve reading is that her power, the ability to manipulate matter at a fundamental level, is not what the show has presented it as. The on-screen explanation is that Eve was a test subject of a private military scientist, that her powers are a result of that experiment, that she has been training herself out of the restrictions her father once placed on her, and that she is, by the time of the show's later seasons, one of the few beings on Earth who could conceivably stand against a Viltrumite alone. The fan reading is that the experimental explanation is a cover, and that Eve's power is, in some way, cosmic in origin. The scientist who experimented on her did not actually grant the power, the theory says. He merely activated something that was already in her, and the source of that something is somewhere out in the larger universe of the show. The most popular version of this argues that Eve is, in some way, connected to whatever beings are responsible for the universe's largest scale energies, whether you call them gods, or interdimensional sources, or simply the deepest layer of the show's physics. The show has been quietly laying clues. Eve's ability to manipulate organic matter, which most matter manipulators in fiction cannot do. Eve's ability to heal what the show treats as fundamentally unhealable. Eve's tendency to glow in colors that the show's animation team uses for very specific cosmic phenomena. None of this is confirmed by dialogue. It is all interpretive reading. But the show has consistently treated Eve as more than a powered human, and the theory simply takes that consistency and runs with it. A companion reading argues that Eve's power has a real cost that the show is not yet showing you. Every time Eve does something on the scale of healing a destroyed city or reshaping a battlefield, something inside her is being spent. Whether it is years off her life, or pieces of her memory, or a slow erosion of the body she has been keeping intact through her own power, there is a ledger somewhere that is being filled in, and the show is going to reveal the balance in a moment that hurts. Fans who push this point at small physical signs, the way Eve gets quieter after big uses of power, the way she sleeps differently afterwards, the way she eats differently, the way the color of her skin shifts slightly in the days following a major event. The show has not committed to any of this as canon, but the visual consistency is there, and the theory simply names what the animation has been quietly doing. The darkest Eve reading argues she will, eventually, be more dangerous than Mark. Mark can level a city, Eve can reshape one. Mark can fight a god, Eve can rewrite the ground the god is standing on. The show is, slowly, building Eve into a being whose moral choices are going to matter more than anyone else's, because she is the only character on Earth whose power can be used to fix things, rather than just to break them. The corollary is that the moment Eve becomes convinced that something cannot be fixed, the show is going to give us its most frightening scene, because what Eve looks like when she gives up is something the show has not yet shown you. The theory is not that Eve goes evil, the theory is that Eve gives up, and that the show is, in some sense, the story of all the things that are quietly working to keep her hopeful. The Viltrumite Empire itself is the next great node, the species and the civilization that produced Nolan, and that the show has so far revealed in glimpses rather than full views. The most established Viltrumite reading is the one that argues the Empire is, by the time of the show, a great deal weaker than it pretends to be. The case is built on circumstantial evidence. The Empire has only ever sent a handful of soldiers to Earth at any given moment. The Empire's leaders, when they do appear, seem unwilling to commit major resources to fights that, by their own standards, should be trivial. The Empire seems strangely interested in recruiting Mark, in turning Nolan back, in negotiating rather than crushing. The Empire is a giant trying to fill a uniform that no longer fits, the reading says. Something happened in their history that thinned them out, and every confident appearance they make on Earth is a bluff sustained by the fact that no one on Earth, until now, has known the truth. The deepest version of this argues that the Viltrumites suffered a catastrophic loss of numbers, possibly through plague, possibly through a civil war, possibly through a sterilizing event in their distant past, and that this is the actual reason they conquer planets. The conquest is not really about glory or expansion. It is about replenishment. The Empire needs new bodies, new genetic stock, new soldiers to fold into its ranks, and the half-Viltrumite children produced on conquered worlds are not byproducts of Empire but its central purpose. Read this way. Mark is not a complication for the Empire. He is the entire point of the Earth assignment. Nolan was sent to make him. Every Viltrumite intervention from the show's second season onwards is, by this reading, an attempt to bring Mark home to a civilization that needs him in a way it has never quite admitted, even to itself. Sitting next to this is the theory that the Viltrumite Empire is being held together by a single ruler whose own legitimacy is wearing thin. The show has not yet fully explored the Viltrumite court, and what fans build here is largely extrapolated from the comic, with the careful caveat that the show is making its own choices. By most accounts, the comic suggests a Viltrumite ruler who is, beneath the propaganda, a usurper, the old line of Viltrumite emperors having been killed off in a previous purge, and the current authority using the conquests as a kind of constant noise to keep his own population from noticing what they have lost. The show is going to slowly introduce this politics, the theory says, and one of the eventual reveals is going to be that the Empire's strongest soldier and the Empire's legitimate ruler are not the same person. Whether the show ever takes this from the comic, in its own form, is unknown. But the foundation is there. The Empire has, in every appearance so far, been written with the specific texture of a civilization that is afraid of being looked at too closely. A smaller Viltrumite theory has to do with the way they age. The show has established that Viltrumites age very slowly, that Nolan, despite looking like a man in his 40s, has been on Earth for the better part of 2 decades and has seen far more than that elsewhere. The show has been very deliberate about hiding the actual age of the Viltrumite characters, the reading goes, and the reveal of how old some of them really are will land like a thunderclap. Some of the Viltrumites we have already met are, in real terms, older than recorded human history. The show is going to use this to deepen the cosmic horror of the situation, not by making the Viltrumites stronger, but by making them older, by making it clear that they remember Earth as a place that did not exist yet, when they were already adults. Whether the show ever lands this on screen explicitly is another question, but the theory is the kind of theory that recasts every Viltrumite line of dialogue when you start watching with it in mind. The cosmic Viltrumite reading is the one that argues there is a true homeworld, somewhere, that the Empire has been hiding even from its own soldiers. What the Viltrumites call the homeworld is not actually their original planet. The original Viltrum was lost long ago, possibly destroyed, possibly poisoned, possibly simply abandoned, and the world the Empire now calls home is a relocated capital built on a planet they conquered after their first one fell. This is the great Viltrumite secret, the theory holds, the one no Viltrumite soldier is allowed to even ask about, and the eventual discovery of the truth, by Mark or by Nolan, or by someone in the Coalition, is going to be the thing that finally cracks the Empire from inside. The reading is gentle in some versions, where the truth is presented to the Viltrumites as a chance to start over, and brutal in others, where the truth is used as a weapon to break the Empire's morale before a final fight. The show has not committed to either version, but the structural setup is there, and fans have been mapping it for years. Alan the alien grows out of the Viltrumite story like a counterweight. The giant, cheerful interstellar enforcer has gone, across the show's seasons, from a comic relief side character into one of the most consequential figures in the cosmic plot. The first Alan reading is that the Coalition of Planets, the organization Alan works for, is not exactly what it has presented itself as. The on-screen version of the Coalition is an interspecies alliance of worlds resisting Viltrumite expansion. The deeper interpretation is that the Coalition is, in fact, an organization in transition, that it began as a defensive alliance and is in the process of becoming something more ambitious, something more imperial in its own right. Alan, who has been promoted across seasons into positions of increasing authority, is going to be one of the figures who decides what the Coalition becomes, and the show is going to use his arc to explore the question of how you build a counter-empire without becoming the thing you set out to oppose. A companion reading argues that Alan, despite his easy charm, has been quietly hiding a level of strategic intelligence that the show has only begun to show you. The goofy persona, the obvious jokes, the slightly cartoonish presentation are all part of the way Alan disarms the people around him, and there are scenes, especially in his quieter moments with Mark, where you can see him working out angles that he never quite explains. Alan is, in the long run, going to be the show's most important diplomat, the figure who actually negotiates the Coalition's expanded role, the figure who Mark turns to when the politics get too complicated for the punching. Whether this is foreshadowing or simply good writing depends on your reading, but the theory has a strong following because it makes sense of the way the show keeps placing Alan in rooms where, on the surface, he does not quite belong. The bigger Alan reading argues he is, in some sense, the show's true protagonist of the cosmic plot. Mark's story is, at heart, the story of a young man learning how to live with his father's mistake. Alan's story is the story of a civilization learning how to live with the consequences of being made into a weapon. Alan was engineered, generations back, as a member of a species designed for combat against a specific enemy. Across the show's seasons, he has been finding out what that means for him personally, and the show has used those discoveries as the gateway into the wider cosmic politics. The most important questions in the show, the questions about what species are for, what civilizations owe each other, what victory looks like in a war that has been going on for generations, are being asked through Alan rather than through Mark. The show is, in some sense, telling two stories at once, and the cosmic one belongs to Alan. A smaller Alan reading has to do with his survival. He has, by the show's later seasons, taken a frightening number of injuries that would have killed any normal member of his species. The fan reading is that he is, despite his cheerful presentation, being modified, repeatedly, by Coalition medical scientists, and that he is becoming something that even the Coalition is not entirely sure how to classify. The eventual reveal will be that Alan, after enough rebuilding, is no longer really a member of his original species at all, and this is going to give him a particular kind of authority when he eventually negotiates with the Viltrumites, because he will be a being who, like them, has chosen to keep going past the point where any reasonable body would have stopped. The Space Racer subplot lives inside this cosmic cluster too. Space Racer is, in the comic, a major figure whose presence in the show has been hinted at, but not yet fully delivered. Fans have been waiting for him for several seasons, and the speculation about how the show will use him has become its own little ecosystem. The most popular reading holds that Space Racer will appear in a moment of cosmic emergency, late in the show, and will represent a kind of older generation of cosmic resistance, a figure who fought the Viltrumites before any of the current characters were born, and who carries with him both the knowledge of how to beat them and the despair of having tried and almost failed. Space Racer is going to be used as a kind of mentor figure for Alan, more than for Mark, and one of the show's great quiet emotional beats is going to be a scene where Space Racer hands the responsibility of the cosmic resistance to a younger generation. Whether the show ever delivers this is unconfirmed, but the structural slot is there. The antagonists who keep coming back are their own quiet gravity inside the show. Conquest is the first of them. The Viltrumite soldier, whose introduction was one of the most brutal sequences the show has ever produced, and whose return, in whatever form, has been one of the most theorized events in the fandom. The first Conquest reading is that he is not actually dead. The fight at the end of his arc was decisive enough that the audience was clearly meant to accept his defeat as final. But the Viltrumites have shown themselves to be unusually durable, and Conquest specifically has been built up as a survivor of impossible damage. He is somewhere out in the dark, the theory says, in a healing tank, or in a body bag, or in the slow process of being rebuilt by a Viltrumite medical apparatus, and he will return for one final confrontation with Mark, this time with the additional motivation of vengeance for whatever Mark did to him. A smaller version of this says Conquest will return but will be reduced, that the damage Mark did was permanent, and that the version of Conquest who comes back will be a man who has lost something, who fights with less joy, who has been changed by the experience in a way the Viltrumites themselves are not used to seeing. This version of Conquest will be more philosophical than the first one, more interested in why Mark is the way he is, more willing to talk before he fights. The show is going to use the second Conquest fight, if it ever happens, to slow down and ask a question, rather than just to have another action set piece. None of this is confirmed. It is built on the way the show has, every time it has brought a villain back, taken the opportunity to deepen them, rather than just to repeat them. Battle Beast deserves his own cluster. He is the character whose pure love of combat has, for many fans, made him one of the most fascinating figures in the show, because he is not really a villain in the traditional sense. He is a being whose entire moral framework is built around finding a fight worth having. The fan reading is that Battle Beast is, eventually, going to be an ally rather than an enemy, that he will find himself in a situation where the strongest fighters in the galaxy are on Mark's side, and the cause he wants to throw himself into requires him to stand with them. Battle Beast does not really care about empires or politics. He cares about the quality of the fight, and by the time the cosmic plot reaches its climax, the quality of the fight will be on Mark's side. A smaller version of this says Battle Beast will die in that final fight, and the show will give him the death he has been chasing his entire life, and the death will be beautiful rather than tragic, because for him, dying in a fight worth fighting will be the only kind of victory he has ever wanted. The bigger villain reading is that the show is building, very slowly, towards a final antagonist who has not yet been properly introduced. Fans who push this point at small references in dialogue, at the way certain characters look past the camera in their cosmic scenes, at the way the show has been careful never to name the highest figure in the Viltrumite hierarchy on screen. The show is keeping a final villain in reserve, the theory says, a Viltrumite figure of such size and authority that introducing him earlier would unbalance the show's middle seasons, and this figure is going to be the one Mark eventually has to confront in the show's final episodes. Whether the show ever delivers him is unconfirmed, but the slot is there. In the structure of the show, the way an empty chair at a dinner table tells you that someone is expected. The Immortal is, by every measure the show has been willing to give you, the oldest character on Earth, and one of the most underused. He is presented as a man who has lived through the better part of recorded human history, who has been a soldier in wars whose names most viewers do not remember, who carries with him a kind of slow, tired authority that the writers have not always known how to use. The first Immortal reading is that the show is, deliberately, holding him back, that the writers have decided that the Immortal's actual history is so large that it cannot be unfolded inside the show without warping the structure of the main plot, and that they are saving him for a sequence of flashback episodes that have not yet arrived. There is, Somewhere on a whiteboard in a writer's room, a list of the wars the Immortal has fought in, the names he has gone by across centuries, the men and women he has loved and outlived, and this list is the foundation of an entire season's worth of material that the show is waiting to deploy. The most popular Immortal theory is that he was, at some point in his very long life, an actual historical figure, and that the show has dropped clues about which one. Fans who push this point at the specific way the show animates his older memories, the costuming, the architecture in the background, the way certain pieces of dialogue echo lines from documented historical writings. The show is being careful to keep the answer ambiguous, the reading goes, partly because committing to a specific historical identity would limit the character, and partly because the ambiguity is more powerful than the answer. You are supposed to walk away from every Immortal scene, wondering whether he was at this battle, or that coronation, or that famous meeting, and the cumulative weight of those wonderings is meant to give him the texture of a man who has actually lived through all of it. None of this is confirmed canon. It is all a kind of audience archaeology that the show has invited and never explicitly answered. The darker Immortal theory is that he is, in some sense, beginning to break. No being, even one with a body that does not age, can carry the kind of grief the Immortal must be carrying, without something giving way. The show has been showing you small fractures, the way the Immortal sometimes does not respond when his name is called, the way certain colors of light seem to make him pause, the way he has begun, in the later seasons, to repeat himself in ways the earlier seasons did not show. The show is building, very slowly, towards a story arc in which the Immortal himself becomes a problem that the heroes have to manage, not because he turns evil, but because he is no longer entirely himself, and the question of how you help a friend whose grief has finally caught up with him at the scale of centuries is one that the show has, in this reading, been quietly preparing. A smaller Immortal reading says he has been keeping secrets about Earth itself, that there are pieces of human history he was present for that have never made it into any history book, and that he is the only living source for the truth about certain events. The show is going to use him as a way to deliver pieces of world building that would otherwise feel imposed. The Immortal will, in a series of late-season conversations, drop revelations about why certain countries are shaped the way they are, why certain myths exist, why certain places on the planet have always been considered haunted, and these revelations are going to tie back into the cosmic plot in ways that the audience has not yet anticipated. The theory is gentle and almost academic, but it is the kind of theory that gives the show an extra dimension if you watch with it in mind. The Immortal and Duplicate have their own subplot inside this cluster. The show has placed them in a relationship that the fandom has spent a great deal of time analyzing, partly because the difference in their ages is so vast as to be almost comic, and partly because the show has been careful not to be dismissive of it. The relationship is the show's way of asking what intimacy looks like across radically different timescales, and the answer the show is offering is gentler than viewers were prepared for. Duplicate, by virtue of being a person whose own life is shaped by her duplicates, has a particular kind of empathy for someone whose continuity has been stretched across centuries, and the two of them have found in each other a kind of mutual recognition that none of their other relationships could offer. None of this is dialogue, it is all read out of the way the show frames their scenes. But the theory has a strong following, and it is the kind of reading that softens what could otherwise feel like a difficult plot choice. Mark's family beyond his parents is the next great web. There is his half-brother Oliver, his future with Eve or Amber or whoever the show eventually chooses, and the wider question of what kind of dynasty the show is, knowingly or not, beginning to construct. The first theory here is the one about Oliver, the half-Thraxan, half-Viltrumite child Nolan fathered on a different planet, and the boy who has, in the show's later seasons, been growing up at an accelerated rate. Oliver is, in the long run, going to make a choice the show has been carefully avoiding, the reading says, and the choice is going to be the choice his father would have wanted him to make. The show has been showing you, very subtly, that Oliver does not share Mark's moral framework, that the rapid maturation has compressed his ethical development into something more transactional, and that he is going to be willing to do things, at some point in the show's future, that Mark cannot bring himself to do. The theory is not that Oliver becomes a villain. The theory is that Oliver becomes the family member who does the difficult things while Mark refuses to, and that this is going to be one of the show's most painful long arcs. A companion reading says Oliver is going to die. The show has been writing him as a character whose presence raises uncomfortable questions, and the easiest narrative way out of those questions is to remove him. The show will, at some point, kill Oliver in a moment of sacrifice or accident, and the death will be used to push Mark towards a decision that he has been resisting. The darker interpretation is that the show will use Oliver's death to test Debbie, to give her the experience of losing a child she had no biological claim to, and had every reason not to love, and to show you that Debbie's capacity for grief and decency is one of the show's deepest reservoirs. None of this is confirmed. It is built on the way the show has, every time it has introduced a child character, gone out of its way to make their fate uncertain. Mark and Eve, by a clear margin, are the most popular romance prediction in the show's fandom. The show is, slowly, walking towards a long-term relationship between them, the reading says, and the show has been very deliberate about not rushing it. Amber, who was the show's earlier love interest for Mark, was always going to be the right person at the wrong time, and the relationship's collapse, when it came, was the show's way of clearing the field for the story it has been quietly preparing. Mark and Eve are, in the long run, the show's emotional center, and the show is going to give them a relationship that is not just romantic but operational, in the sense that the two of them will eventually become the people who make the show's biggest cosmic decisions together. The popular version imagines them eventually having a child, and the speculation about that child has filled forums for years. Press the child theory and it becomes a theory about the show's eventual time skip. The show is going to, at some point, jump forward by years. The structure of the final seasons is going to require it, and the time skip will let the show explore a Mark who is no longer learning who he is, but is, instead, navigating what he has become. The child of Mark and Eve, if the show ever introduces her, will be the protagonist of the show's final stretch, and the show is, by this reading, telling not just a story about Mark, but a story about the first 3 generations of a new kind of family on Earth. Whether the show ever takes this step is, of course, unconfirmed. It would be a major creative choice, and it would change the texture of the show significantly, but the foundations have been there, in the way the show keeps insisting on the longevity of its Viltrumite characters, in the way the show keeps reminding you that Mark is going to outlive most of the people he loves. There is a more specific Amber theory worth pausing on, which holds that Amber is going to come back into the show in a role that has nothing to do with romance. Amber, having walked away from Mark for the right reasons, has the moral clarity to function as a kind of conscience for him later in the show. And the show is going to bring her back in a moment, when Mark needs someone who is not impressed by him to tell him a truth he does not want to hear. Amber's exit was the show's way of preserving her, of keeping her separate from the cosmic plot, so that when the show eventually needs to drop her back in for 1 or 2 key scenes, she can carry weight that no character closer to the action could carry. None of this is confirmed. It is the kind of reading that depends on the show being patient, but the show has, so far, demonstrated that it is willing to be. William has his own quiet subplot. William, Mark's college roommate and best friend, has been one of the show's most reliable presences, and a long-running fan reading says the show has been quietly preparing a much larger role for him in its later seasons. William, who is the only main character without powers, and the only main character who has functioned as Mark's emotional anchor since the beginning, is going to be put in a situation where his ordinariness is what saves the day. The show is going to use William to remind you that the cosmic plot, in the end, is about what kind of life is worth saving, and William, by being the one whose life is worth saving precisely because it is so unremarkable, is going to give the show one of its most quietly powerful endings. None of this is confirmed, but the way the show keeps protecting William, the way it keeps returning to him, the way it keeps insisting on him as a presence in Mark's life, suggests that the writers are not going to waste him. Rex Splode runs the inverse of this arc. Rex, who began the show as one of its most unpleasant characters and has, across the seasons, been quietly redeemed, is the subject of a fan theory that says he is going to die. The show has, again and again, given Rex moments of growth. His arc has been one of the most carefully constructed redemption stories in the catalog, and the show has been preparing him for a death scene that will work as the emotional payoff for that redemption. Rex is going to sacrifice himself in a moment that lets the show show you what he has become, and the death will be brutal, but the brutality will be the point, because the show is, among other things, a show about how the people you wrote off can sometimes turn out to be the ones who save you. None of this is confirmed, but the structural shape of Rex's arc is, in this reading, that of a man being prepared for a goodbye. The alien cluster widens the frame, the cluster about the various non-Viltrumite species who have shown up in the show, sometimes briefly and sometimes at length, and whose presence on the wider canvas of the story has, for many fans, hinted at a much larger cosmology than the show has yet committed to. The Flaxans are the first node. The diminutive interdimensional invaders whose attacks on Earth, treated by the show with a certain ironic detachment, have become one of the recurring set pieces in the early seasons. The basic Flaxan theory is that they are not, in fact, the joke they appear to be, that the show has been using them as a kind of comic relief, precisely so that their eventual serious appearance lands harder. The Flaxans, whose time dilation across dimensions means that what looks like a brief skirmish for us is, on their side, decades of military planning, are a civilization whose true scale the show has not yet shown you. There is, on the Flaxan side of the dimensional barrier, an entire empire that has been building strategies against Earth for what amounts, in their experience, to multiple generations, and the eventual proper Flaxan storyline is going to be one of the show's most surprisingly dark arcs. A version of this that goes further argues that one specific Flaxan figure, hinted at but not yet developed, is going to emerge as a major antagonist on a scale comparable to Conquest or Battle Beast. The Flaxan ruler, or whatever the actual political structure of their society turns out to be, is a figure of patience and intellect, who has been studying Earth's defenses for decades on their side, and who is going to attack at the moment Earth is most distracted by the Viltrumite crisis. The show is going to use this attack to make a point about how planets fall, which is rarely from the threat you were preparing for, and almost always from the threat you assumed was already taken care of. None of this is confirmed by dialogue, but the structural slot is there, in the way the show has, season after season, returned to the Flaxans without ever letting them be conclusively beaten. The Sequid theory is more disturbing. The Sequids, the parasitic alien creatures that have appeared in the show in increasingly serious contexts, are the subject of a fan theory that says they are not, in the long run, going to be defeated, and that the show is going to use them to deliver one of its most genuinely horrifying storylines. The Sequids represent something the show has been hinting at since the beginning, which is the possibility of a kind of mass possession event, a scenario in which large numbers of humans are turned, against their will, into vessels for an alien intelligence that does not really understand the difference between a person and a body. The show is going to deliver a Sequid invasion arc in which significant numbers of characters we have come to care about are taken over, and in which the heroes have to decide whether killing the body of a friend in order to kill the Sequid inside is something they can morally do. The reading is grim, but the show has been laying foundations for it for years, in the way it keeps returning to the Sequids, in the way Robot has consistently been the character most comfortable interfacing with them, in the way the show has been careful never to fully explain what the Sequids actually are. A companion reading argues that the Sequids are, in some way, related to or aligned with one of the other cosmic species, and that their eventual invasion is going to be coordinated with another threat. The show is, in the long run, going to combine two of its dangling alien threats into a single multi-front attack, and the moment we realize the Sequids and the Viltrumites are not actually independent of each other will be one of the show's true horror beats. None of this is confirmed. It is the kind of theory that works best when held lightly, as a possibility rather than a prediction. But the foundations are there, in the way the show has consistently treated the cosmic plot as more interconnected than it sometimes appears. The Thraxans have their own subplot. The rapidly aging species who have become important through Oliver's heritage are the subject of a fan theory that says they are, in some way, evolutionary relatives of the Viltrumites, and that the rapid maturation that defines them is the result of a much older shared biology that has been forgotten by both species. The show is going to, eventually, deliver a reveal about the deep evolutionary history of the major species in its universe, the reading says, and this reveal will recast both the Viltrumites and the Thraxans in ways that have implications for Mark and for Oliver. Mark and Oliver are not just half-brothers but, in some sense, two compressed versions of the same older evolutionary lineage, and this is going to be the foundation for their eventual reconciliation or for their eventual divergence. The theory is, like so many in this cluster, unconfirmed. It is built on small dialogue choices, on the way certain characters look at each other in cosmic scenes, on the slow building texture of a universe whose internal logic has been growing more coherent with every season. The Omni-Man are a different kind of alien-adjacent storyline, one that returns us to Earth and to D.A. Sinclair, the brilliant and morally bankrupt scientist whose project of converting captured criminals into obedient cyborg soldiers has, in the show, been treated as both a punishment and a research program. The first Omni-Man theory is that Sinclair has been kept on by Cecil for reasons that go far beyond his usefulness as a designer. Sinclair is, in fact, a kind of insurance policy against a specific scenario, and Cecil is keeping him available because there is a thing only Sinclair can build, and Cecil is waiting until he is desperate enough to order it. The show is going to deliver an episode in which Cecil tells Sinclair what he actually wants, the reading says, and the thing he wants is going to be more unsettling than anything the Reanimen have shown you so far. The Reanimen, as we have seen them, are prototypes. The true Reanimen are going to be something else entirely, and the moment they are deployed will be the moment Cecil and Mark's relationship breaks for good. A companion reading says Sinclair himself is going to be turned into a Reanimen. The show has been quietly setting this up, the argument goes, that Sinclair's own body is going to be taken into the program he designed, possibly against his will, possibly as a kind of poetic justice, and that the resulting figure is going to be one of the show's strangest moral problems. Cecil, when he gives the order, will not be doing it out of revenge, but out of efficiency. He will look at Sinclair and see an enormous amount of potential trapped inside an inconvenient ego, and he will simply remove the ego. The theory is bleak, but it fits the way the show has written Cecil, as a man whose practicality is, by the end, the most terrifying thing about him. The next cluster is one of the most affectionate in the catalog, and it is the cluster about the show's production itself. The Easter eggs the writers and animators have buried in episodes, the voice casting choices that look, in retrospect, like jokes, the visual quotations the show is constantly making to other comics and other series. The famous one is the theory that the show's voice casting is, in itself, a form of foreshadowing. The show has, since its first season, cast actors whose other famous roles map directly onto the kind of arc their characters are going to have. J.K. Simmons, as a man whose calm is hiding violence. Steven Yeun, as a young man being pushed past his limits. Sandra Oh as a wife discovering something she did not want to know. The show is using your memory of other performances to layer additional meaning into the scenes, and some of the show's most surprising emotional beats are landing harder because the actors are deliberately drawing on the audience's existing relationship with their voices. The version that goes deeper says that the casting of supporting characters is, in itself, a series of jokes the show wants you to catch. Every time you recognize a voice on a side character, the show is doing it on purpose, and the cumulative effect is meant to give you the feeling that the world of Invincible is being voiced by a kind of secret cabal of actors who keep appearing in each other's work. This is part of why the show feels so populated, why every minor character feels like they have an interior life, even when you only meet them for a single scene, because the actors voicing them are bringing with them the texture of other roles. None of this is confirmed in any official sense, but the casting director's track record speaks for itself, and the show's willingness to cast at this level for characters who only appear once or twice is in itself an artistic choice that fans have spent years tracking. The animation Easter eggs are their own subculture. The show's animators have a documented habit of slipping references into background frames, posters on walls, t-shirts on minor characters, headlines on newspapers, advertisements on the side of buses. The animation team has built up, across the seasons, a kind of dense visual code that rewards repeated viewing, and some of these references are meant to be foreshadowing rather than jokes. Certain background details, certain logos, certain street names are doing double work, on the surface giving you a small piece of comedy, and underneath setting up a plot point that will not pay off for several episodes. There are fans who have built spreadsheets of these references, who track each appearance, who try to correlate them with later events. The show is, in this very specific sense, a slow puzzle, and watching it with the puzzle in mind makes it a different kind of experience than just watching it for the plot. The title sequence has its own smaller version of this. The show's opening sequence has been the subject of multiple frame-by-frame analyses, with fans arguing that specific images in the sequence are foreshadowing specific events, that the choice of what to show and what to omit is itself meaningful, that the sequence is, in effect, a kind of summary of the entire upcoming season, delivered in compressed form. The show has been doing this since the first season, the reading goes. There are moments in the Season 1 opening that, in retrospect, were directly setting up moments in Season 3, and this is the kind of thing the writers and animators do because they assume their audience is going to rewatch. The show is, at every level, written for repeat viewing, and the casual viewer is meant to get one experience, while the rewatching fan gets a different and richer one. The music has its own quiet thing. The show's soundtrack, both the score and the licensed song choices, has been the subject of a great deal of analysis. The show is using specific songs, in specific moments, to signal things that the dialogue is not signaling, and some of the song choices are foreshadowing rather than commentary. The show has, on at least one occasion, used a song whose lyrics, if you actually read them, are explicitly about a character's eventual arc. The music supervisor is, in effect, a member of the writing team, and the choices being made about what plays during what scene are part of the storytelling, rather than just window dressing. None of this is confirmed in the official sense, but the consistency of the choices is hard to ignore, and fans who push this theory tend to be the fans who watch the show with the volume up. The Divergence cluster sits squarely on top of the gap between the Amazon series and the original comic book by Robert Kirkman. The show has been making, season by season, a series of careful choices about what to take from the comic and what to leave behind, and the most foundational reading is that the show is, deliberately, telling a kinder version of the story than the comic told. The comic, while justly celebrated, took its violence to places that no animated television show, even one as willing to bleed as Invincible has been, has any real interest in following. The show's writers have been preserving the comic's emotional structure while changing the specific events that produced it, the reading says. The show is, in some sense, a translation rather than an adaptation. The show is, in the end, going to deliver a different ending than the comic did, and the divergence between the two has been growing season by season, precisely so that the show can land somewhere the comic did not. A version of this that goes further argues that the show has been making choices specifically to give certain characters happier endings than the comic gave them. The show's writers have looked at certain comic arcs and decided that the cruelty was not earning the meaning, and the show is going to redirect those arcs into places where the meaning survives, but the cruelty does not. This is most visible in the way the show has handled certain characters who, in the comic, were treated as plot devices, but who, in the show, have been given more interior life. The expanded interiority is going to make it harder for the show to deliver some of the more brutal comic events without significantly rewriting them, and the writers are, in some sense, painting themselves into a corner of decency that they will eventually have to navigate out of. The opposite reading is also Liv, the one that argues the show is, in fact, going to be crueler than the comic in certain specific moments, and that the divergences from the comic are not all gentler. The show, having spent time investing in characters that the comic moved past quickly, is going to use the audience's attachment to those characters as a weapon, and some of the show's later seasons are going to deliver losses that the comic readers, despite their familiarity with the source material, were not prepared for. The show is keeping a few twists in reserve specifically so that book fans cannot predict them, and the show's willingness to invest deeply in certain characters early on has been part of a long-term setup for emotional damage. This is, in some sense, an act of respect for both audiences, that the show is going to give the comic fans a story that still surprises them, while giving the new viewers a story that feels coherent on its own terms. Anissa belongs in this cluster, because the show has made one of its most significant divergences from the comic in the way it has handled her arc. The comic took her relationship with Mark to a place that has been controversial since the day it was first published, and the show, having to figure out how to handle that material, has made choices that are still visible in the way the character is written. The first Anissa theory is that the show is, in the long run, going to give her an arc more focused on her own role inside the Viltrumite political structure than on her relationship to Mark. The show is moving her from being primarily defined by her relationship with the protagonist into being defined by her own loyalties and her own ambitions, the reading goes, and this is going to lead to one of the show's most complicated villain arcs, in which she is, at different times, an enemy, an unwilling ally, and a figure whose own moral framework is not the framework Mark uses but is, in its own way, internally consistent. A companion Anissa reading argues she is going to defect. The show has been showing you small signs of her growing discomfort with the Viltrumite culture she has been raised inside, and the eventual outcome of those signs is going to be a moment of decision in which she breaks with the Empire. The show is going to use her defection as the inside view of the Empire that the Coalition has needed for years, and her eventual position is going to be a kind of ambassador role, in which she is permanently in between worlds. None of this is confirmed. It is built on small line readings, on the way the show frames certain Anissa scenes, on the slow building suggestion that she is not entirely comfortable with what she has been asked to do. The reading is gentler than the comic gives any reason to expect, but the show has, so far, been gentler than the comic in similar ways. Damien Darkblood lives inside the Divergence cluster too. The demon detective who in the first season immediately identified Nolan as the killer of the Guardians was used briefly by the show before being moved off screen, and his eventual return has been one of the more confident predictions in the fandom for years. The first Damien theory is that he is going to come back at the worst possible moment, that he is going to surface again when the show needs a moment of moral clarity about something the heroes are trying to look past, and that his return is going to be played not as a triumph, but as an indictment. Damien functions, in the structure of the show, as a kind of conscience that none of the characters wanted, the reading says, and the writers have been keeping him in reserve specifically for a moment when his particular kind of inarguable honesty is going to be required. A companion reading says, Damien is, in some sense, already involved in events that the show has not yet revealed. Demons in the show's cosmology are not just supernatural figures, but representatives of a much larger underworld that the show has been hinting at without committing to. And Damien's continued presence in that underworld is going to give him access to information about other plot threads that the heroes do not have. Damien is going to return with knowledge of, for example, what happened to certain bodies after certain fights, of what certain villains who were thought to be dead have actually been doing in the time since, and this knowledge is going to reframe events the audience thought were settled. None of this is confirmed, but the foundation is there in the show's willingness to leave him off screen for so long without ever ruling out his return. There is a long tail of smaller villains the show has only brushed against, the ones who have appeared briefly but who, in the comic, have larger roles, and who the fandom has been waiting for. Dinosaurus is the first, the genius scientist whose body has been transformed into a kind of intelligent reptilian monster, and whose appearances in the comic were among the most morally complicated villain arcs in the entire run. The show is going to bring Dinosaurus back, the fan reading goes, in a form that may differ from the comic, but that will preserve the central tension of the character, which is that he is doing terrible things for reasons that are not exactly wrong. The show is going to use Dinosaurus to deliver one of its most uncomfortable moral debates, in which the heroes have to argue with a villain whose proposals for fixing the world are, on their merits, not entirely indefensible. This is the kind of villain Invincible is best at, the kind whose presence forces the heroes to examine their own assumptions rather than just to punch someone. Powerplex is one of the most quietly devastating subplots in the fandom's catalog. Powerplex, in the comic, is a figure whose grief over family lost in a Mark fight drives him to an obsession with destroying Mark, and the fan reading is that the show is going to deliver a version of this storyline in a way that is even more uncomfortable than the comic. The show has been carefully establishing, in its background, the human cost of every Mark fight, every collapsed building, every ambulance running through a destroyed street, and the show is going to, at some point, introduce a figure whose entire arc is built on the truth that Mark, in the course of saving the world, has killed a great many people he never met. The eventual confrontation with this figure is going to be one of the show's most difficult scenes, because Mark is going to have to face a man whose pain he caused, and whose grievance is not a misunderstanding or a manipulation but a fact. The show is going to refuse to give Mark an easy out from this scene, and the resolution is going to be a kind of mutual diminishment, in which neither character walks away whole. Multi-Paul is a much lighter subplot, but it is one fans have been amused by for some time. The duplicating villain who can produce copies of himself in vast numbers has appeared in the show, and is the subject of a fan theory that says he is going to be used, in a later episode, as the test case for a much more terrifying duplicating threat. The show is going to use his abilities to demonstrate that the kind of mass appearance the Sequids might generate, or the kind of cloning robot might attempt, is something Earth's heroes can in principle handle, and the moment Multi-Paul shows up will be the moment the show is, in fact, foreshadowing a larger duplication crisis later. The theory is small, and the show has not committed to it, but the structural logic is there. Magmaniac is a smaller node still, but it has appeared often enough in fan discussions to be worth mentioning. The molten figure whose appearances in the show have been brief but distinctive is the subject of a theory that says his power set, or his origin, is connected to a deeper Earth history that the show has not yet explored. The show has, in its background world building, been hinting at the existence of subterranean civilizations or buried alien artifacts on Earth itself, the reading goes, and Magmaniac's eventual proper introduction is going to be the gateway into that material. The show is going to deliver, at some point, an Earth-based plot that has nothing to do with the Viltrumites, and everything to do with what was already on Earth before the Viltrumites arrived. None of this is confirmed, but the slot is there in the show's structure, and fans who push this theory tend to push it gently, as a hope, rather than a prediction. Doc Seismic is one of the funniest small theories in the catalog, because it leans on the show's willingness to give even a clearly comic villain a strangely consistent through-line. The costumed earthquake-themed villain whose appearances have been treated by the show with a certain amount of affectionate cruelty is the subject of a fan theory that says he is, in fact, going to be the cause of one of the show's most catastrophic events. The show has been quietly building up his abilities, in jokes, in throwaway lines, in background news reports, and the eventual payoff is going to be a moment when an apparently low-tier villain triggers a disaster that none of the high-tier characters were prepared for. The show is, in this very specific sense, an argument for taking villains seriously even when they look silly, and Doc Seismic is the show's chosen vehicle for that argument. None of this is confirmed, but the theory has its adherents, and they tend to be the fans who pay closest attention to the smaller plot threads. Mark's powers themselves deserve their own pause, since they are, despite being one of the central facts of the show, more poorly understood by the audience than the audience tends to admit. The first theory here is that Mark's powers are still developing, and that the show is, gradually, going to reveal abilities that he did not know he had. Viltrumite biology, as the show has presented it, has been deliberately ambiguous. Some of the things Nolan does in fights are not consistent with the things other Viltrumites do, and the variation is the result of personal development rather than fixed species traits. Mark, given enough time and enough provocation, is going to discover that he can do things even the senior Viltrumites cannot, the reading says, and the moment of that discovery is going to be one of the show's most pivotal turning points. The show is, very slowly, telling you that Mark is not just half human and half Viltrumite, but is, in some emergent sense, a new thing. A companion reading argues that the half-human, half-Viltrumite combination is, in itself, a previously untested category, that the show has been hinting that no half-Viltrumite child has been allowed to develop to adulthood before Mark, and that the Empire's interest in him is partly the interest of researchers who do not actually know what is going to happen as he grows. There is, in the Viltrumite chain of command, a faction that wants Mark studied alive, and another faction that wants him eliminated as a contaminant, and the show's various Viltrumite arrivals on Earth have been the field expressions of those internal disagreements. The show is going to deliver a season in which the Empire is, for the first time, openly divided about what to do with him, and Mark's eventual conversation with a senior Viltrumite is going to be less about loyalty and more about classification, about what category of being he actually is. A smaller power reading turns on Mark's flight. The show has been consistent about the way Mark flies, but the comic and the show have both, at various moments, suggested that the mechanism of Viltrumite flight is not entirely understood, even by Viltrumites. Flight is, in fact, a form of unconscious matter manipulation, the fan reading argues, and this is going to matter for understanding Eve's powers and for understanding the deepest layers of the show's physics. The show is, in the long run, going to deliver a scene in which Mark and Eve realize that what they have been doing as separate things are, in some sense, the same thing, and this realization is going to redefine the working dynamic of every fight they share for the rest of the show. The theory is small and almost technical, but it has its defenders, and they are not wrong to notice that the show has been careful never to fully explain why flight works. Mark's mind is the next great node. The show has been increasingly willing to explore his inner life, and the question of what cumulative trauma is doing to him is one the writers seem to be sitting with. The first reading here is that Mark has been in a low-grade kind of post-traumatic state since the Season 1 finale, and that the show is, in its later seasons, going to escalate this into a much more serious mental health storyline. The show has been showing you symptoms, in his sleep patterns, in his short fuses, in the way he responds to physical contact in certain scenes, and the show is going to, at some point, give him an actual breakdown, an episode in which the accumulated weight of every fight and every loss finally catches up with him. This episode is going to be one of the show's quietest and most affecting, the reading says, and it is going to involve Debbie and Eve in roles that the show has been building them towards. The show, despite being a superhero series, is not interested in pretending that the costs of being a superhero are anything other than the costs of being a person who has seen too much. A companion reading argues the show is going to do something almost unprecedented in the genre, which is to give a superhero protagonist actual therapy. The show has been hinting at this, in the way certain side characters have mentioned mental health support, in the way Cecil has, on at least one occasion, asked Mark whether he is talking to anyone about what he has been through. The show, in its later seasons, is going to give Mark a recurring scene in which he is sitting in a room with a professional, talking about what has happened to him, and this scene is going to become one of the show's emotional anchors. This is the kind of risk the show is uniquely positioned to take, because it has been investing in its character work since the first episode, and the eventual payoff would be one of the show's most distinctive contributions to the genre. None of this is confirmed, but the foundations are there in the way the show has refused to look away from emotional consequences. The rebuilt Guardians of the Globe come next, the team that was reconstituted after the first season's slaughter, and whose internal politics have been a slow-building subplot. The first reading is that the new Guardians, as presently constituted, are going to fail, and that the show is going to deliver an arc in which the team has to be rebuilt again, this time from the ground up. The new Guardians have inherited the institutional weight of the old team without inheriting the actual experience or the actual trust, and the next major Earth threat is going to find them unprepared in ways the audience has not yet seen. This failure is going to be one of the show's most painful subplots, the reading says, because the audience has come to care about the individual members of the team, and watching them fail collectively is going to be different than watching them fail individually. The show is, in this subplot, telling a story about how institutions fail, which is to say slowly, and then all at once. A companion reading argues the show is going to introduce a parallel team, a second roster of heroes that the audience has not yet met, and that this second team is going to function as a kind of mirror to the official Guardians. The show has been quietly suggesting that there are heroes operating outside of the Global Defense Agency's structure, the reading says, that the world of Invincible is larger than just the characters we have been shown, and that the show is going to use a second team to make a point about what kinds of heroism the official structures do not allow. This second team is going to include figures who, in the comic, were either villains or marginal characters, and the show's willingness to recast them is going to be one of its bolder creative choices. None of this is confirmed, but the structural slot is there, and the show has, on at least one occasion, dropped a line about characters operating outside of the official roster. Smaller, romantic, and emotional subplots gather their own affectionate cluster. The first is the theory about Rexplode and Duplicate, whose relationship in the early seasons of the show was both rocky and oddly tender, and whose eventual fate has been the subject of much speculation. The show is, in the long run, going to give them a second chance, the reading says, and this second chance is going to be played not as a romance subplot, but as a study in what it means to grow up after you have done something stupid. Rex's redemption arc and Duplicate's quiet growth across the seasons have been moving on parallel tracks, specifically so that the two of them can, at some point in the show's later seasons, meet again as different people. The theory is gentle, and the show has not committed to it, but the structural shape is there. Black Samson is his own small subplot, the team member whose own powers have been restored and restored again across various plot lines is the subject of a fan theory that says he is going to take on a kind of senior statesman role inside the new Guardians, and that his eventual function will be to be the one team member who actually understands how to lead. The show has been quietly building him up as the figure the other Guardians turn to when Cecil's instructions do not match the situation on the ground, the reading goes, and his eventual role is going to be the role of the Guardians' moral center. This is the kind of role that the comic gave to figures who, in the show, have been treated differently, and Black Samson, whose comic arc was more about personal struggle than leadership, is being given a slightly more elevated function in the show. None of this is confirmed, but the show's affection for him is visible, and fans have been right to notice it. Bulletproof is a quieter recent addition. The young hero whose introduction was relatively recent in the show's run is the subject of a fan theory that says he is being set up as a successor figure for Mark, that the show is going to, at some point, place Mark in a situation where he can no longer be the Earth's primary defender, and that Bulletproof is going to inherit some version of the role. The show has been carefully writing Bulletproof as a kind of younger Mark, with the same kind of doubts, the same kind of family tensions, the same kind of moments of decision, and the audience is being prepared, season by season, to accept him as the kind of figure who can fill the gap. None of this is confirmed, but the parallels are there, and the theory tends to be most popular among fans who have been watching long enough to recognize the shape of a passing of the torch when they see it. Monster Girl's backstory has its own quietly devastating reading, because the show has been so deliberate about hiding her actual history. There are pieces of her past that the show is saving for a later flashback episode, the fan reading says, that the curse that ages her body backwards has a more specific origin than the show has revealed, and that the eventual reveal is going to be one of the show's most quietly devastating retroactive recontextualizations. The show has been writing her with the knowledge of who she used to be in mind, that her dialogue choices, her body language, her way of relating to other team members, are all consistent with a story the audience has not yet been told, and the moment the show finally tells it is going to make the audience want to rewatch every Monster Girl scene from the beginning. None of this is confirmed, but the texture of the writing is unusual enough that the theory has real weight. The wider human world of the show is its own continent, the parts of Earth that exist outside of the immediate fights, the the part of the audience that the show is willing to spend time with, even when the cosmic plot is loud. The first reading in this cluster argues that the show is, very slowly, building a picture of how the rest of humanity is actually responding to the existence of superhumans, and that the show is going to deliver, at some point, a season in which the politics of being a hero on Earth becomes one of the main plots, rather than a background. The show has been hinting at this. The news broadcasts that turn against Mark for the wrong reasons. The protests that the camera holds on for an extra second. The legal questions that surface in conversations between Cecil and his colleagues. The show is preparing a regulatory crisis, the reading says, a moment in which governments around the world decide that the existence of superhumans is no longer something they are willing to let private organizations manage. And this crisis is going to put Mark in a position where he has to defend not just his right to fight, but the legitimacy of doing so without permission. A companion reading argues the show is going to bring back, in some form, the kind of public villainy that the comic was often willing to engage with, in which the line between a superhero and a public figure becomes too thin to be meaningful. The show has been writing Mark as a young man who, despite being one of the most powerful beings on Earth, has remained almost touchingly unaware of his own celebrity, and this unawareness is going to be exploited. The show is going to give him a public scandal, the kind of thing that comes from a misread quote or a leaked photograph, and the way Mark navigates the scandal is going to be one of the show's most distinctive subplots, because the show has been very careful to make him a young man whose moral instincts do not always travel well in the form of sound bites. The show, in this subplot, is going to make a point about the gap between being a good person and being seen as one, and the gap is going to hurt. College and the small ordinary plots make their own quiet cluster, the ones the show has been refusing to give up even as the cosmic stakes have risen. The show is going to at some point deliver an episode in which Mark goes back to college after a long absence, and the absurdity of the contrast is going to become the point of the episode. The show has consistently used the college setting as a way of grounding Mark in something approximating an ordinary life, and the show is not going to give that grounding up easily, even after the plot has, in narrative terms, moved beyond it. The eventual closing of the college plot, whenever it happens, is going to be one of the show's emotional milestones, because the audience has come to associate that setting with Mark before everything got too heavy. The theory is sentimental, but the show has been earning its sentimentality, and the reading is, in some sense, a request rather than a prediction. William has his own quiet subplot inside this cluster too. William, whose own arc has been progressing alongside Mark's without ever taking the spotlight, is the subject of a fan theory that says the show is going to give him, at some point, his own significant emotional moment, and that this moment is going to be played not as a side beat, but as one of the show's central scenes. William's life, both his relationship with Rick and his ongoing position as the only main character without powers, is the show's most quietly built-up arc, and the eventual payoff is going to be one of the show's most affirming. The show is going to use William to make a point about what kind of bravery actually matters in a world full of cosmic threats. And the point is going to be that the bravery of staying soft, of refusing to be hardened by what you have seen, is a kind of bravery the show takes more seriously than it sometimes admits. Rick runs the parallel of this. Rick, William's boyfriend who was abducted and reanimated by D.A. Sinclair and then partially rehabilitated, is the subject of a fan theory that says his eventual fate is going to be the show's most direct confrontation with the question of whether anyone who has been broken can be put back together. The show has been writing him with careful attention to the differences between recovery and restoration. The reading says that the show is refusing to pretend the two are the same thing, and that the eventual storyline involving Rick is going to be the show's clearest argument for why those differences matter. Rick is going to make a choice, at some point in the show's later seasons, about the kind of person he wants to be in the body he has been left with, and the choice is going to be played as quietly as possible, with no fanfare, because the show is going to want the audience to understand that the choice is bigger than the spectacle around it. A more cosmic strand surfaces here, concerning the kinds of deep cosmic structures that the comic gestures at, but that the show has not yet committed to. The first reading is that the show is going to introduce a parallel cosmic faction, one that has nothing to do with the Viltrumites and nothing to do with the Coalition, and that this faction is going to function as a kind of third wheel in the show's later seasons. The show, having spent its first several seasons setting up the basic Viltrumite versus Coalition tension, is going to enrich the cosmic plot with a third player, and the third player is going to be motivated by something neither of the existing factions cares about. This is going to recast the cosmic plot in a way the audience has not anticipated. The assumption of a binary war is going to be revealed as too simple, the reading says, and the show is going to deliver a sequence in which the heroes are forced to negotiate with a power they did not know existed. A companion reading is more speculative still, and it argues that one of the show's existing characters is, in fact, secretly aligned with this third cosmic faction. The show has been planting clues, by this reading, in small line deliveries, in the way certain characters seem to know things they should not, in the way certain characters appear in scenes that, on reflection, they should not have been able to reach. The eventual reveal is going to be one of the show's most jarring, the theory says. A character the audience has trusted is going to turn out to have been carrying a different agenda the entire time, and the moment of the reveal is going to be played as a moment of personal betrayal rather than as a moment of cosmic shock. None of this is confirmed, but the show has been careful to leave enough doors open that the theory remains live, and fans have been right to notice the openings. Mr. Liu has his own small subplot, and it concerns the question of whether the show is going to engage with the kind of magical realism that the comic was occasionally willing to explore. The immortal Chinese crime lord whose presence in the comic was one of its strangest and most beloved tangents is the subject of a fan theory that says the show is going to bring him in, eventually, and that his presence will signal the show's willingness to expand its tonal palette into territory it has not yet visited. The show, despite its general commitment to science-fictional and superhuman framing, has been quietly leaving room for the supernatural, in the form of Damien Darkblood, and in the form of certain ambiguous moments around the Immortal, and the introduction of Mr. Liu or a character like him would confirm that the show's universe is genuinely magical as well as scientific. This would be one of the show's bolder creative choices, because it would expand the cosmology in a way the show has so far been cautious about. None of this is confirmed, but the comic provides the foundation, and the show has shown a willingness to take from the comic when it serves the larger story. The question of who, in the long run, is going to die has its own contested cluster. Every fandom builds these theories, and Invincible's fandom has built them with more care than most, because the show has demonstrated a willingness to actually deliver on losses that other shows would hesitate to engage with. The first reading is that the show is going to, before its end, kill Debbie. The show has been escalating the danger around her without ever quite paying it off, the argument says, and the eventual death is going to be played quietly, as a consequence of a mistake by someone else, rather than as a deliberate attack on her. The show is going to use her death as the event that pushes Mark into the kind of decisive action he has been resisting, and the structural function of her death is going to be the trigger for whatever final escalation the show eventually delivers. The companion reading is the opposite one, that the show is going to refuse to kill Debbie, that her survival is going to be one of the show's deliberate refusals of genre convention, and that the show is going to use her continued presence in the final stretch as the emotional center that the cosmic plot has to either preserve or fail. The show has, since the first season, been making a quiet case for Debbie's importance, and killing her would undercut the show's entire emotional argument. The show is going to make a point of leaving her alive, possibly even reuniting her, in some form, with what remains of her family, and this survival is going to be one of the show's signature choices, the kind of choice that the audience remembers years after the show ends. None of this is confirmed, but the two theories represent, in their disagreement, the show's actual emotional center, and the question of which way the show is going to break is one that the fandom takes very seriously. Cecil's death theory is its own quietly debated thing. Cecil, who has been positioned across multiple seasons as a man whose body is failing and whose moral compromises are mounting, is going to die, the reading says, and his death is going to be played as both a tragedy and a relief. The show is going to give him a death that allows him to be heroic without erasing the things he has done, and the eventual scene is going to be one of the show's most complicated emotional moments, because the audience is going to have to mourn a man whose absence will also, in some sense, be a vindication. Cecil's death is going to be the event that finally lets Mark take responsibility for the larger choices that Cecil has been making on his behalf, and the show is going to use the death as the gateway into the final stretch of its story. None of this is confirmed, but the structural argument is strong enough that the theory has become one of the most stable in the fandom. There is a structural reading that holds the show is, secretly, a story about time. Every major character in the show is, in some way, operating on a different timescale than the others, and the show is, deliberately or not, building a long meditation on what it means to share a life with people whose internal clocks are running at different speeds. The first reading here is that the show is going to deliver, at some point, an extended time skip episode in which years pass off camera and the audience is brought back into the story to find characters in different places, with different bodies, with different sets of regrets. The show has been quietly preparing the audience for this, by reminding you that Viltrumites age slowly, that Monster Girl is aging backwards, that the Immortal is barely aging at all, that Robot has been growing his body at an accelerated rate. The time skip, when it comes, is going to be the show's way of acknowledging that the cosmic plot is too long to be told in real time, and the audience is going to be asked to accept years of off-screen events as a single emotional gesture. A companion reading argues the time skip, if it happens, is going to be much longer than the audience expects. The show has been positioning itself to deliver, at some point, a flash forward of decades rather than years, and the resulting timeline is going to give us a Mark who is, in some sense, an entirely different person, possibly a parent, possibly someone whose hair has grayed, possibly someone whose moral framework has been tempered by the kinds of decisions that only become possible after enough time has passed. This is going to be the show's most controversial creative choice if it ever happens, because it would represent a significant break from the show's previous willingness to track Mark's growth in close detail, but that the resulting story would, if handled well, be one of the most moving in the show's history. None of this is confirmed, but the structural slot is there, and fans have been noticing it. The smaller version of this argues the show is going to use the time skip not to advance Mark's story, but to make room for a younger generation of characters. The show is going to introduce, after the time skip, a second wave of heroes, possibly including a child of Mark and Eve's, possibly including children of other established couples, and the second half of the show is going to gradually shift its focus from Mark to this younger group. This would be a bold creative choice, because it would risk losing the audience that came to the show for Mark, but the resulting story would be one of the most ambitious in modern animated television. The theory is gentle, and the show has not committed to it, but the foundations are there in the way the show has been increasingly willing to broaden its cast and to give time to characters who, in the early seasons, were treated as side figures. There is a more meta reading of the show, and it concerns the question of what, in the long run, the show is actually about. The show, despite its presentation as a superhero series, is in fact a long meditation on the question of inheritance, on what we are obliged to do with the gifts and the damage our parents leave us. And this is the question every major arc in the show is, in some way, answering. Mark inherits Nolan's biology, and has to figure out what to do with it. Oliver inherits a different version of the same thing, and has to make different choices. Cecil has inherited a job from a previous generation of administrators, and is struggling to do it without becoming the thing he replaced. The Immortal has inherited centuries of grief, and is struggling not to break under the weight. Robot has, in some sense, inherited his own broken body, and is in the process of building a new one. Every character in the show is, by this reading, a study of how inheritance works, and the show's eventual closing argument is going to be a claim about what kinds of inheritance can be refused and what kinds cannot. The companion reading is that the show is, in fact, a meditation on the question of choice in a deterministic universe. The show is, episode by episode, building an argument that the existence of overwhelming power does not, in itself, settle the question of what to do with that power, and the dignity of the show's protagonists is, in some specific sense, the dignity of choosing the harder option when the easier one is structurally available. The show is willing to be honest about the costs of those choices, that it is not pretending that doing the right thing always works out, but that it is insisting, again and again, that the choice itself matters even when the outcome is bad. This is the show's deepest argument, the reading says, and the eventual ending of the show is going to be built around it. A more pessimistic strand asks whether the show is going to deliver a happy ending. The first reading here is that the show is going to land somewhere unambiguously bittersweet, that the eventual ending is going to involve significant losses, that the cosmic plot is going to be resolved in a way that solves the political problem of the Viltrumite Empire, but does not solve the emotional problem of having lived through it. The show has been signaling this since the first season, by refusing to let any victory go uncomplicated, by insisting that every saved city was also, in some sense, a damaged city, by showing you the aftermath of fights as often as the fights themselves. The show is going to be honest about the costs of the story it is telling, and the ending is going to ask the audience to accept that the costs were worth it, without pretending that the costs were not real. A more generous companion reading argues that the show is going to be more generous to its protagonist than the genre tends to allow. The show is going to give Mark, in its final episodes, a moment of actual peace, possibly a scene in a kitchen, possibly a scene on a beach, possibly a scene in a hospital corridor in which someone he loves is alive and the world is quiet, and that this moment is going to be played as a kind of victory that the show has been earning for the entire run. The show, despite its willingness to engage with brutality, has always been a show that cares about its characters, and the writers are not going to take that care away in the final episodes just to satisfy a genre convention. The eventual closing image of the show is going to be a small one, a domestic one, a moment of recovery rather than a moment of triumph, and this image is going to be one of the most lingering closing images in modern animation. A smaller and more affectionate cluster concerns the Easter eggs that the show has been planting about its own ending. The show has, since the first season, been dropping references to specific objects, specific lines of dialogue, specific visual motifs that are going to recur in the final episodes, and the audience is going to recognize them when they appear. There is, somewhere in the show's first season, a shot of a specific object that is going to reappear in the final season, the theory says, and the moment of its reappearance is going to be one of the show's quietest emotional payoffs. The show, in this very specific sense, has been planning its ending since the beginning, and the texture of the writing has been consistent enough that the planning has held up. None of this is confirmed in any official sense, but the show's willingness to plant long-term hooks has been documented across multiple seasons, and the theory is, in some sense, just an extension of that documented pattern. The biggest theory in this stretch concerns what kind of Mark we are going to end the show with. The show is going to give us, in the final episodes, a Mark who is recognizably the same young man we met in the first episode, but who has been shaped by everything that happened in between, and the show is going to insist on this continuity as one of its central emotional arguments. The show is not going to let Mark become his father, by this reading, despite all the foreshadowing, and the eventual ending is going to be a refusal of the becoming Nolan theory, rather than a confirmation of it. The show is going to make a point of showing that the slow erosion of softness that has been visible across the seasons is in fact reversible, that the small moments of grace that the show has been giving Mark are accumulating into a different kind of person than the one Nolan became, and the eventual ending is going to be the show's argument that becoming your father is in fact a choice rather than a fate. The companion is the darker one, which says that the show is going to refuse this resolution, that the show is going to give us a Mark who is, in the final episodes, more like Nolan than the audience wants to admit, and that the show is going to use this resemblance to make its hardest emotional argument. The show, in this version, is going to be honest about the cumulative effect of the violence. The ending is going to ask the audience to accept that being a hero has, in fact, cost Mark something that he is not going to get back, and the show is not going to pretend otherwise. This would be the harder ending, but it would also be the more honest one, and the show, given its track record of refusing easy resolutions, may well choose it. The two endings represent the show's two competing emotional arguments, and the writers have been carefully holding both possibilities open for as long as they can. The most cosmic version of all of these readings is the one that says the show is going to end with a moment of cosmic stillness, with a scene that takes place not on Earth but somewhere out among the stars, with Mark and Eve, or Mark and Alan, or Mark alone, looking at the universe and recognizing, for the first time, that it is too large to be saved by any one person, and that the only thing to do with it is to live inside it for as long as you can with the people you love. The show, despite all its punches and all its blood and all its cosmic politics, has been building, since the first episode, towards a moment of simple looking, of just being present in front of a universe that is too big to fix, and the eventual closing image is going to be this looking. This would be the show's most distinctive choice, because it would refuse the usual genre triumph in favor of something quieter and stranger. None of this is confirmed, but the show has been earning the right to make this kind of choice for years, and the audience would, in the end, accept it. Specific scenes have their own gravity in the fandom, the moments that, for whatever reason, have come to function as the show's emotional landmarks, and that fans return to again and again to find new meaning in. The first of these is the scene at the end of the first season, the scene on the train tracks, the scene in which Nolan asks Mark what he will have when everything else is gone. The fan reading about this scene is that it is, in fact, the entire show in compressed form, that everything the show has done since, every cosmic arc and every quiet domestic plot, has been a long answer to the question Nolan asks in this scene. The show is, in some structural sense, the unfolding of Mark's reply, that every choice he has made, and every loss he has accepted, and every relationship he has tried to protect, is, in the most literal sense, the show's answer to the question of what he wants to have when his father is no longer there to ask him. A companion reading argues that the show is going to, at some point in its final episodes, return to this scene, to revisit it, to put Mark back on a train track of some kind, possibly with Nolan present and possibly without him, and to give Mark a chance to deliver the answer again, with the weight of everything that has happened in between. The show has been preparing this return for years, by this reading, that the specific visual language of trains and tracks and falling debris has been recurring across the show with such consistency that the eventual recall is going to land. The show is, in some sense, going to give Mark a second train, possibly literal and possibly metaphorical, and the scene of the second train is going to be one of the show's most emotionally complete moments. None of this is confirmed, but the fan reading has a long pedigree, and the writers have shown enough care about visual continuity that the theory is more grounded than it might first appear. The Think Mark scene has its own subplot. The famous scene from the first season finale, in which Nolan delivers his most desperate plea while Mark is broken on the ground, has become one of the most discussed scenes in modern animation, partly because it has been turned into a meme, and partly because the meme has, paradoxically, kept the scene's emotional weight alive by reminding the audience of it. The show is, very subtly, aware of the scene's meme status, the fan reading says, and the writers have been writing certain later scenes specifically in reference to it, with the kind of inverted phrasing that rewards the audience for recognizing the echo. There are moments in the later seasons where Mark or another character delivers a line whose structure is a deliberate response to the original scene, and the cumulative effect of these responses is a kind of running emotional commentary on what that scene actually meant. The theory is small and almost academic, but it speaks to the show's willingness to engage with its own cultural footprint without breaking the fourth wall. Eve's mother is the next quiet node. She has appeared in the show in difficult circumstances, and her relationship with Eve has been one of the more carefully written family dynamics on the show. The first reading here is that Eve's mother is, in fact, going to play a larger role in the show's later seasons than the early appearances would suggest. The show has been quietly building her up as a figure who knows more about Eve's origins than she has been willing to share, and the eventual reveal is going to be that there were aspects of Eve's birth and childhood that her mother has been protecting her from. The show is going to deliver, at some point, a long quiet conversation between Eve and her mother, in which old wounds are reopened and old secrets are aired, and this conversation is going to be one of the show's most affecting domestic scenes. None of this is confirmed, but the show has been careful never to dismiss her, and the theory is, in some sense, the natural extension of that care. A companion reading says the show is going to give Eve's father a redemption arc, that the difficult man who treated her so badly in the early seasons is going to be given, at some point, a chance to recognize what he did and to try to make amends, and that the show is going to refuse to let this redemption be too clean. The show is going to make Eve work for any reconciliation with him, that the show is not going to pretend that his behavior was anything other than what it was, and the eventual scene of partial reconciliation is going to be one of the show's most morally complicated moments, because the audience is going to be invited to share both Eve's reluctance and her hope. None of this is confirmed, but the show has been careful, in its writing of Eve, not to let her family be a footnote, and the theory builds on that care. What the show is, in the end, trying to say about heroism itself, is another running argument. The first reading here is that the show is, very deliberately, building an argument that the figure of the superhero is, in fact, incompatible with the structure of modern political life, and that the show is going to deliver this argument as one of its central thematic claims. The show has been showing you, since the first season, that every act of heroism has political consequences that the heroes themselves are not equipped to manage, that the destruction of property and the loss of civilian life and the violation of national sovereignty are all things that follow from the basic premise of superheroes, and the show is going to, at some point, force its characters to reckon with this fact. The show is going to deliver, in its later seasons, an arc in which Mark has to choose between being a superhero and being a citizen, the reading says, and the show is going to refuse to let him have both. The companion reading argues the show is, in fact, going to argue the opposite, that the show is going to insist on the value of individual moral action even in a world too complicated to be solved by any individual, and that the show is going to give Mark, in its final episodes, a moment of vindication for having tried to be a good person inside an impossible situation. The show, despite its willingness to engage with the political and ethical complications of superheroism, is going to refuse to let those complications cancel out the basic dignity of trying to help. The show is going to land on a kind of complicated affirmation, an acknowledgement that everything Mark did had real costs and that, in the final accounting, his trying was still worth something. None of this is confirmed, but the show's emotional structure has, since the beginning, been built around this kind of complicated affirmation, and the theory is in some sense just naming what the show has been doing all along. A more recent strand concerns what the show is going to do with Mark's relationship to non-lethal force. The show has been carefully tracking Mark's relationship to killing, that the line he draws about who he will and will not kill has been moving in ways that the audience has not always noticed, and the show is going to deliver, at some point, a major escalation of this question. The show is going to put Mark in a situation where the only way to save someone he loves is to kill someone he could, in principle, spare, and the show is going to refuse to give him an easy out from this dilemma. The resulting scene is going to be one of the show's most difficult, because Mark is going to have to make a choice that no previous version of him would have made, and the audience is going to have to decide whether the choice is the show's way of moving him forward or the show's way of revealing what he has become. None of this is confirmed, but the structural setup is there. The final cluster of theories before we draw all of this together is the cluster about the show's opening titles, the music that plays over the credits, the small bursts of visual information the audience is given before each episode begins. The fan reading about the opening is that it is, in itself, a kind of summary of the show's deepest argument, that the specific images chosen for the title sequence are not just a montage of action beats, but are a carefully composed visual essay on what the show thinks superheroes are. The opening sequence has changed, subtly, across the seasons, with new images added and old images recontextualized, and the changes are themselves a kind of foreshadowing. The show is, in this very specific sense, telling you what it is going to do before each episode begins, and watching the opening with attention is one of the ways the audience can stay ahead of the writers without spoiling the actual plot. A companion reading argues that the song over the credits, whatever it happens to be in a given season, has been chosen with specific lyrical content in mind, and that the audience is being given a kind of musical commentary on the season they are about to watch. The music supervisor has been working in close coordination with the writers, the reading goes, and the choice of song is, in itself, a piece of writing. The audience can, in some cases, predict the major emotional beats of a season simply by listening carefully to the lyrics of the opening song. This is the kind of detail the show takes seriously because the show takes detail seriously in general, and the cumulative effect of all of these small attentions is the show's particular texture, which is one of the things that has made it the show it is. None of this is confirmed, but the consistency of the choices is, in itself, evidence that someone is paying attention. The last great theory is the one that holds all the others together, and it is the theory that the show, in the end, is a story about whether the world is worth saving. Every reading we have walked through tonight, every speculation about cosmic plots and family secrets and villainous reveals, is in some way a variation on this single question. Whether Mark becomes his father is a version of this question. Whether Cecil's compromises are worth the lives they preserve is a version of this question. Whether Eve's power is going to be used for healing or for breaking is a version of this question. Whether the coalition becomes an empire of its own is a version of this question. Whether the Viltrumites can be redeemed or only defeated is a version of this question. The show is going to land, in its final episodes, on an answer to this question that is neither fully optimistic nor fully despairing, the reading says, and the answer is going to be something like a yes, but only if you keep choosing it, only if you keep doing the work, only if you keep being willing to be hurt by the people and the worlds you keep deciding to love. The show is, in some sense, an extended meditation on this kind of conditional yes, and the entire run of the series is building up to a final moment in which this conditional yes is articulated, not as a slogan, but as a quiet observation made by a young man who has, despite everything, decided to keep going. That, in the end, is the shape of every reading we have walked through tonight. The smaller ones, the larger ones, the ones built on freeze framing, and the ones built on long readings of character. They all return, one way or another, to that question, and they all imply, in their own way, that the show is going to answer it. Whether the answer arrives in a clean closing image, or in a complicated final act, or in a quiet domestic scene that the show refuses to tell you is the ending, the answer is coming, and the fandom has been preparing itself to receive it for years. Before we close out, there are a few smaller theories that deserve their own pause, because they have been quietly running underneath the bigger ones the entire time, and the fandom would not forgive us if we did not name them. The first is about Mark's costume itself. The yellow and blue suit, which has gone through several small redesigns across the seasons, is the subject of a fan reading that says the color choices are themselves significant, that the show has been adjusting them frame by frame to track the changes in Mark's confidence and Mark's identity. The suit is, in some sense, a barometer, the reading says. The color and the cleanliness and the way the light catches it in certain shots are choices the animation team is making in coordination with the writers. The final season's suit, whenever the show reaches it, is going to look different in ways the audience will notice without quite being able to articulate, and the differences are going to be the show's quiet visual argument about who Mark has become. None of this is confirmed, but the consistency of the visual choices is hard to ignore, and the theory has held up across multiple rewatches. Mark's hair has its own small theory. This is, on the surface, a comic theory rather than a show theory, because the comic famously used Mark's hair length and Mark's hair color as a kind of long-term emotional barometer across hundreds of issues. The fan question is whether the show is going to use the same device, whether the animators are going to start giving Mark different hair as the show progresses, whether his hair is going to grow longer or shorter, or gray or vanish entirely at moments that match the emotional weight of the plot. The show has, so far, been more cautious about this than the comic was, the reading goes, but the show may, in its final stretch, allow itself to make the kinds of visual choices about hair and body that the comic was famous for. The theory is small, but it points at the larger question of how willing the show is going to be to physically mark its characters as time passes, and that question is one of the show's quiet long-term decisions. The Mauler Twins' original origin keeps generating its own reading. The fandom has spent a great deal of time speculating about who the original Mauler was, before he was cloned, before he became one half of a duo whose entire identity has been the question of which one is which. The show is going to deliver, at some point, a flashback episode in which we see the original alone, in his original life, before any of the cloning began. This flashback is going to be tonally different than the rest of the show, the reading says. The original Mauler is going to be presented not as a villain, but as a brilliant, lonely man whose first decision to clone himself was, in some sense, a tragedy disguised as a triumph. The show, despite its general willingness to use the Maulers as comic relief, is going to give them, eventually, a single episode of unexpected emotional depth. None of this is confirmed, but the Mauler dynamic, when you watch it carefully, is too internally consistent to be unconsidered, and the theory has its adherents. Cecil's office has its own small theory. The room itself, where so many of the show's most important conversations take place, is the subject of a fan reading that says the layout has been changing, subtly, across the seasons, and that the changes are not just animation drift but deliberate visual storytelling. Certain objects have been added to the office, and certain objects have been removed at moments that correspond to plot beats the audience has not yet been told about. The room is, in some sense, a small piece of foreshadowing, by this reading, that the writers are using the set design as an additional channel for information. None of this is confirmed, but the consistency of the changes is enough to be noticeable, and the theory rewards the kind of close attention that the show has, in general, been written to reward. The news broadcasts that appear briefly throughout the show have their own little reading. The news anchors, the broadcasters, the brief snippets of public reaction that the show drops in between scenes are not just background, but are themselves a kind of running commentary. The headlines have, on more than one occasion, foreshadowed plot beats that have not yet arrived, the reading says, and the audience can, with sufficient attention, predict certain story turns by paying close attention to what the news is actually saying. The show is using its background media in the same way it uses its title sequence, as an additional storytelling channel, and the cumulative effect is to make the show's world feel larger than the specific scenes the audience is being shown. The show's title cards have their own quiet theory. The episodes have, throughout the run, used title cards as a kind of compressed emotional summary, and the fan reading is that the title cards have been making jokes that, in retrospect, were not entirely jokes. The writers and the animators have been using the title cards as a way to slip in foreshadowing that the audience would not, on first viewing, recognize as such, and the show is rewarding the audience that pays attention to these small moments. The reading is gentle and almost playful, but the show has, on at least one occasion, used a title card to deliver a kind of meta-commentary that did, eventually, pay off in the plot. The last small theory is the one about silences. The show, despite its willingness to deliver some of the loudest action sequences in modern animation, has been quietly investing in its silences, in the moments when no one is talking, when the score drops out, when the animation slows down and the audience is left in a kind of held breath. These moments are the show's actual emotional center, the reading argues. The show is more interested in what people do not say than in what they do, and the eventual ending of the show is going to be characterized more by its silences than by its dialogue. The show is, in some sense, a show about what cannot be said between the people in it, and the silences are the show's way of letting the audience hear it. None of this is confirmed, but the consistency of the choices is real, and the theory has, perhaps more than any other, the quality of a small private observation that once you have noticed it, you cannot stop seeing. That, then, is the long catalog. The cosmic theories and the domestic ones, the ones about Mark and the ones about Cecil, the ones about the Viltrumites and the ones about the news broadcasts, the ones built on careful reading of dialogue and the ones built on freeze framing of single shots. They sit in the fandom together, sometimes contradicting each other, sometimes reinforcing each other, sometimes simply existing side by side as different ways of paying attention to the same show. None of them are the show. The show will, in the end, be whatever it ends up being, and the fandom's job is to wait for it. But the theories are part of the way the show actually exists, in the lives of the people watching it, and the catalog we have walked through tonight is, in some sense, a portrait of the show as it has lived inside its audience. And so we come, at last, to the close. It is worth saying out loud, here at the end, that Invincible has become something larger than the sum of its parts. It started as a comic book run that ended years before the show arrived, and the show, when it came, was not obviously going to be the cultural object it has become. It has become, somewhere along the way, the rare animated series that adult audiences can talk about with the same seriousness they bring to live-action prestige drama, and the rarer thing of a superhero story that has earned that seriousness through patient writing rather than through novelty. The reason the fandom builds theories on this scale is the same reason it does with any story that genuinely rewards attention. The show has, since its first episode, been quietly betting that its audience would be willing to look closely, and the audience has, for years, been delivering on that bet. There is something restful, in the end, about a story this big. The cosmic stakes are large enough that the small ones get their proper context. The violence is honest enough that the kindness is allowed to be honest too. The characters are written with enough patience that the fandom can build around them an entire world of speculation that the show does not quite confirm but does not quite deny either. That space, between confirmation and denial, is where every theory we walked through tonight actually lives, and it is where, in some sense, the show actually happens. The episodes themselves are only one layer of it. The arguments and the freeze frames and the long forum posts and the quiet rewatches at 1 in the morning are another layer, and the two layers, together, make the thing that the show has become. If you have made it this far, then you have walked through, in one sitting, a portrait of a fandom that has been arguing about a show for years, and has, by and large, kept arguing in good faith. That is rare. It is also, in its small way, one of the better arguments for the kind of stories Invincible has been telling, which are stories about whether the work of paying attention to each other is, in the end, worth it. The fandom has answered that question in its own way, by paying attention to a show this carefully for this long. And the show, for as long as it continues, will keep giving the fandom new things to pay attention to. So that is where we leave it tonight. The catalog of theories is closed, the lights are low, and the city outside is still. Sleep well. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.